Did you ever get the feeling, as you're staring at the ceiling, that this game of life we play ain't fair? Seems as fast as we can make it, there's a hand that grabs and takes it till they plant us in a grave somewhere. Like a rodent on a treadmill, we keep pushing for it uphill, but we never seem to get too far. Well, if you think you're being taken, then you're ready to awaken to the truth of what we really are. We're all indentured, servitudal slaves, overburdened and bewildered feudal knaves, who have lost our sole posterity through ignorance and apathy, and now we're being taxed out of our graves. And as long as we stay passive, we'll succumb, contented with some socialistic crumb. Well, the naked truth and fact is, we're all saps who pay our taxes, and that is why the banksters keep us dumb. Could the state of our condition be the product of omission, what we didn't learn in public schools? And did our fathers all through history all fight and die for liberty so we could play the tyrant's fools? And can you call it education when it's all indoctrination to obey the hidden powers that be? Did we fight the revolution? Did we win the world wars just to slumber in the slavery? Let's stop being indentured, servitudal slaves, overburdened and bewildered feudal knaves, and reclaim our lost posterity, rise up and proclaim liberty. It's high time we rock the boat and make some waves, 'cause as long as we stay passive, we'll succumb. They'll starve us on their communistic crumb. And the naked truth and fact is, we don't have to pay those taxes. Yes, it's time we show those banksters, those international gangsters. So let's turn the tables and spoil all their fun.
That's all.
God bless the Republic and the United States, and death to the New World Order! Yeah! All right!
Welcome, folks. We are live tonight. It is 18 April, year of our Lord 2010. Have a absolutely spectacular show tonight. First off, I wanted to say that I want to dedicate this particular broadcast to the late, great Terry Liberty Parker, who I believe during the whole time of the 51 days in Waco, Texas in 1993, Terry Liberty Parker, to me, provided the clearest voice of anybody that I'd heard. The mainstream media was just mimicking what the daily FBI press conferences were talking about. It was just really just a bunch of bullshit for the whole 51 days.
That's right. The mainstream media was 100% smear propaganda.
That's all it was.
About the Davidians. And Terry basically ignored all that and just focused on what was important.
Yes.
And that was a bunch of people, men, women, and children, as he put it, were killed for basically no reason.
Yep.
On live television.
So this show is dedicated to Terry tonight. In fact, we've got a exclusive interview. I know it's played before, but it's still an exclusive. Mike Hanson, the director of this program, did an interview with Terry Liberty Parker concerning the events in Waco, Texas. We're going to be playing that. We have, by the way, folks, we're not taking any phone calls tonight either, because we have very special guests scheduled to call in here at the bottom of the hour. So we got the Terry Liberty Parker interview. We've also got Steve Lane. He did a interview with a county commissioner in Waco, Texas, talking about the events as they unfolded in Waco, Texas in 1993. At the end of the broadcast, about 10:55 p.m., we're going to play the classic 17 Little Children. Many people do not know this, but on April 19th of 1993, 17 innocent children were basically murdered inside the Mount Carmel facility. And so what you're going to see tonight, folks, is going to be a different point of view, then if the mainstream media mentions these activities tomorrow, or what happened in Waco, Texas in 1993, it'll probably be something like this. On this date in 1993, vicious cult members from Waco committed suicide by burning the building and killing themselves, while loving government agents tried to rescue them.
And all those children deserve to die a fiery death because their parents worship Jesus in a slightly different way than most Christians.
Well, he said he was Jesus.
Oh yeah, so then it's okay. That settles it.
So anyway, that's so it should be a jam-packed show here tonight, and so with that, I want to. There's one thing that's happening tomorrow I want to mention, and that is tomorrow. I can't believe I'm promoting MSNBC, but tomorrow on MSNBC. And Sasan mentioned this will probably be a bunch of bullshit too.
Oh,
but they're running the McVeigh tapes, Confessions of an American Terrorist, and one of the featured personalities that will be seen is Mr. Actor Gary Teague, who plays
McVeigh's grandfather.
Yeah, so that'll be airing tomorrow, 8 p.m. CST. On MSNBC, and then there's some reruns too.
Yeah, I think Friday of next week, and then Sunday also it'll re-air.
And you said outside that you have nothing to do with the content. You're just strictly an actor.
Yeah, just
if it turns out to be a bunch of bullshit, then
solely as an actor.
Okay, so let's get some comments. Sasan, what's your take on this whole Waco situation? I know you said you didn't really know too much about it during the actual.
All I knew is what the media told me, and all they said repeatedly over and over again. These guys were dangerous extremists, and they had to be taken down, or else they would do whatever. You know, they never said what they're planning to do. But yeah, I mean, I was obviously I wasn't yet an adult in 1993, but I still do remember very vividly what the front page of the Austin American-Statesman looked like in 1993 on the day that happened. I remember there was a huge photo that took up the entire front page of the compound on fire.
Of the building.
And of the building, right? Yeah. They call it a compound.
Talk about public opinion being against these people.
And above that, in very large block letters, were a tragic end. A tragic end. And that was the only time I actually saw a somewhat sympathetic view towards the Branch Davidians. So to be honest with you, I haven't really heard much about it since then. It's been kind of swept under the rug. People like to forget about it, unless, of course, they're trying to scare people about the rise of extremists that are basing their extremism on what happened in Waco that day.
I wanted to, Gary, your take on the events in Waco, Texas, April 19th, 1993.
Well, I watched most of it early morning before I went to work. And that one particular morning, I don't remember exactly what day it was, but when I seen those military tanks coming into what they call the compound, I knew right then that no good was going to become of it. When you use military tanks, especially in a civilian situation like it was, that, like I say, it was going to be a bad ending.
Do you know that 17 children died that day?
I do. Yeah,
in fact, we've got a song that was dedicated to that coming up here at the end of the show.
Of course, they made it look like it was the Davidians' fault that all those children were killed.
Yeah, and so like I say, folks, this should be a dynamic show. We're scheduled to have Clive Doyle call in here at 10:30 p.m. Clive was one of the ones that spent the whole 51 days in the Mount Carmel facility, and he got his hands burned when he tried to escape. You can still, the last time, the scar tissue. He said he barely made it out of there alive because there was smoke all over the building, and Gary and Sasan both have questions for him when he calls in. So it should be a dynamite show here tonight. And again, I want to thank everybody for being here and making this all happen. tomorrow is they're actually going to have a. Did you want to just? Yeah, tomorrow I'm heading up to Waco with Mike Hanson, and we're going to have. They're going to have a kind of a memorial up there in Waco. We're all going to go to Mount Carmel facility and that kind of thing, just as a memorial to these people. And like I say, if the mainstream media mentions it at all tomorrow, for sure they're going to mention the McVeigh situation, because, like you say, they'll play that up as, we got to get anybody that that disagrees with the government into this label. But if they do mention the events in Waco, Texas, in 1993, it'll probably be something. Would you say something to the effect that, well, on this day in 1993, vicious cult members committed suicide by catching their compound on fire?
Yeah, it'll be something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, we're going to go to the classic interview with Terry Liberty Parker discussing this exact topic of Waco, Texas in 1993. Here we go. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Here we go.
These jurors were by the government's own testimony about what happened at Waco to the Branch Davidians. Now understand, this is after the trial is over. Is the newspaper establishment, in this particular story, it's the Associated Press, is asking the jurors, what did they think? What comments do they have? They were just fit to be tied. It turns out that those tanks that we watched on the day of the assault, the final assault when there was the big fire and everything, those tanks that we watched on television were not just poking holes in the wall to insert gas into the structure. This is a residence that's occupied by men, women, and children, yet those tanks that we saw, according to this trial testimony, the government's testimony, those tanks were ordered to penetrate this residence occupied by men, women, and children. The government's strategy as described at the trial by the government itself was to bring this structure down. This is a residence occupied by men, women, and children. Our government, that is supposed to be based on the ideals of freedom and liberty, justice for all, our government instructed its government agents to climb into tanks and roll those tanks into a structure that's occupied with men, women, and children. And as a result, some of the children that we were told the government was saving died as the structure came down and crushed skulls. They died from blunt force trauma to their skulls. It's like this. For people who are wondering, how come there's a militia movement that's growing in this country? Well, it used to be, I'm over 50. I was 52, just had a birthday just here recently. And we used to use the phrase up in arms as sort of a metaphor. It was kind of a joking metaphor. People are up in arms about this or that. But when you have a government that orders its agents to get into tanks and run those tanks through a residence occupied by men, women, and children, and then there are no indictments. There's no indictment of the tank drivers. There's no indictment of the people who ordered the tank drivers. There's no indictment of any of the high officials. At that point, the truce has broken down, and the phrase "up in arms," the people are up in arms, is the only thing that's left for them as a reality, instead of it being a metaphor. So yeah, you have a growing militia movement because we now have a government that isn't technically violating the Constitution or technically creating injustices. We've got a government now that does it in a big way, does it on television, doesn't even get to sweep it under the rug, testifies at trial that what it did was order its agents to get into tanks and run the tanks through a residence occupied by men, women, and children, and there are no indictments. of any of these people. At the very least, they should be indicted for manslaughter, if not murder. We haven't had that happen, and that's why you have a militia movement that's growing in this country. They see a government that may, depending on which aspect of the militia you ask, there's going to be different things that bother them, and maybe you won't agree with them on this issue or that issue. But the one point that we can all agree on is you cannot have a government that just arbitrarily kills people, runs tanks through houses, and not even have the agents who drove the tanks be indicted. You cannot have that. At that point, there is no more choice. You have to be up in arms. You have to be ready to deal with that government in the same way that it's dealing with their citizens. Now, I'm not advocating that.
Okay, folks, we're back. That, of course, that was the late, great Terry Liberty Parker. I think everybody in the studio probably misses him.
Absolutely.
Yes, I really miss him.
He definitely was a very clear voice, and what was really a sea of bullshit coming out of the mainstream media during this whole event. Lorraine Denardis joins us on set here. Lorraine, how do you feel about the events what's your take on the events that took place in Waco, Texas in 1993?
I'm actually feeling pretty enlightened because when I was watching the news back in high school, this is not the story that I got at all.
Yeah.
It was completely a different story. And I never really gotten a chance to see it like that. And I'm really kind of shocked. And I'm so glad that Terry brought this to light.
Well, the mainstream media has done this on many, many issues. They're quick to rush to war, the war propaganda. I've seen this time in, time out, and that's one of the reasons I watch very little of it. Is because, frankly, to me, they're just it's propagandists masquerading as journalists. So, I mean, not to make this a media show, but so how do you feel about those tanks? Now, this is what Terry said. It was written in the Austin American Statesman. This was printed in the Austin American Statesman. I didn't see it, but he did. That said that while these agents were in court, these government agents actually testified in court that they got into tanks and proceeded to drive those tanks into buildings occupied by men, women, and children.
I would like to know what their justification is. Why did they do this? Why did they feel the need to drive tanks into buildings?
Well, I'm sure their justification is what most of these government agents are, is we were just doing our jobs. That's the excuse you hear over and over and over again. I was just following orders. I was just doing my jobs. And the purpose of Terry making that video, I thought, was to kind of cut to the quick. That's complete nonsense. Every individual is responsible for their own actions. You cannot pass the buck to anybody else.
But what was going on there was so bad that they needed to drive tanks.
Well, let me just say something right here. These tanks that are fixing to go into this building. Do you have it going into the building? Okay, right there. Still it right there. Okay, folks. What you're seeing on the screen right now is basically totally unacceptable. What you're seeing right there is a government that's not legitimate anymore, a government that's outlaw, a government that is willing to, on its own American citizens, drive tanks into these buildings and occupied by men, women, and children, of which many of these children died during this event. And then there's the rummage from it all in 1994. So anyway, do you have anything else, Hassan, before we go to this county commissioner thing?
No, I think we was covered, and you might want to give the viewers an idea of what this next video is going to be about, because this next video presents some information that I personally had never heard of before.
Go ahead.
And that was the racial makeup of the Branch Davidians. I never before today ever heard mention that the Branch Davidians were anything but all white. As it turns out, upwards of 30% of them were black. And for whatever reason, the media never covered that all these black people were killed at the same time as the rest of the Davidians. That was a shock to me, that after all these years, this was the first I was hearing it. So here's an interview. What's the gentleman's name?
Wretched?
No, stretch it. Just stretch it. We're trying to get it queued up.
Okay. Go ahead, Lorraine.
Well, I mean, when I was watching the news back then, it made it seem like that it was sort of a necessary evil, like on the news, or something like they never really went out about how many people who were killed in this action. It was just like a bunch of nuts that kind of deserved what they got.
Yeah,
Is that what it was?
Well, that's the way the mainstream media portrayed it, yes. But like I say, they've done this. Oh, yeah, coming up here, we have Steve Lane, who actually called in last week from Tennessee. He'll be talking to Lester Gibson, McLennan County, Texas, Precinct 2 Commissioner, about these events and the raid on the Branch Davidians. Interview taped in 1999. So let's go ahead and run that if we can.
Town hall meeting, and I'm joined by Mr. Lester Gibson, who is a county commissioner in McLennan County, which Waco is inside your county. And I had asked him the question off the air, and he's going to answer it now, if he was aware and what his comments would be, finding out that roughly 33% of the people that died in the church in Waco were black.
No, I'm aware of that particular figure, and I knew an attorney in that particular company.
We know Sheila, by the way. We're good friends with Sheila.
Right. So I'm aware that there were a sufficient number of African Americans who perished in the fire.
And what were your feelings when, I got to tell you, I was pretty upset just not hearing any outrage, either publicly or from public officials, about what transpired there, because you can say what you will about the adults, but there were women and children that died there that were all innocent. Maybe some of the adults were guilty of something, but the children, every one of them was innocent. What was your reaction to the fact that there were no public officials, white or black, that came out and said, hey, wait a minute, tanks on babies? I mean, I'd be interested in hearing your response to that.
Number one, I mean, it was televised nationally. Everybody in the world saw what was going on. Everybody could formulate their own opinion. And that's something that was exposed, and the opinion itself, you understand, basically could have been forthcoming. Such as the opinion now that we got with President Clinton. It wasn't a spin that the media wanted to put on it, and therefore you got the spin, you understand, that they wanted the American public to see and perceive. Just that simple.
I'd be interested in getting you a videotape. I don't know if you're aware, there's a documentary out called Waco Rules of Engagement.
I'm aware of it.
Have you seen that FLIR footage?
The area is in my precinct, okay? I'm County Commissioner Precinct 2. The Elk area is in my precinct, so I'm aware of the footage. The film and stuff like that. But again, it's what the media put the spin on. You understand?
And who owns the media?
That's correct. So I don't control it.
Right.
I can't give the spin, but it's a fact that what happened.
I think it's important to know, and I'm glad you're here and listening to this, because we try. It's what the theme of what we saw in the town hall here was to educate. And what people do once they have that education, I can no longer control. But I do have some control over the fact that many people haven't been educated to many of the facts that we just spoke of. And I think as they do, when they learn, there's Harvard Law graduates in there, I think a lot of people think, well, these are a bunch of crazies. But you mentioned knowing Mr. Martin. I mean, Harvard Law graduate, for goodness sake. This is not a crazy, kooky person. And when we learn, I think as the black community particularly learns that 33% of those people that died were in fact black, I think suddenly they realize that that's a situation where it wasn't just a bunch of crazy white people. I mean, there was people of all races and ethnicities in there, and I like to educate people to that fact and let them make their own decisions and choices.
I mean, but that's a fact that it was a great number of women, a great number of children, of all ethnic group. But in regards to your question about African American, you had a great number of African American who was in that. You had a great number who was released.
That's right. That's right. Well, listen, I appreciate your time, Mr. Lester Gibson, and your county commissioner in Precinct what?
Precinct 2.
Okay, folks, we are back live. Gary Teague is with us, and we should be getting a call in here from Clive Doyle, who was one of the survivors. Spent the whole 51 days in there. Coming up here about 10:30, and Gary, so what did you so? You were against it from the beginning, right? Or did you fall prey? You know, if you watch it, if you watch what was coming out during that whole 51, the FBI was conducting they had daily news conferences on location up there, and one day they made the comment, they were molesting kids, or kids were being abused in there, which was debunked later on, and then the next day they said, they were manufacturing drugs in there, which was debunked later on. So it's just like, and then the final day they said, correct, this isn't good enough, so we'll just say this. David Koresh said he was Jesus. It was just like a bunch of bullshit for that whole 51 days. Mm-hmm. Did you see that? Were you seeing through any of that? Or?
Oh yeah. I watched. Whenever I got home, I'd watch it, and then of course the things they had on it in the news reports. But what bothered me was the fact that the way it was done. I mean, there were people, especially like the county sheriff, knew him, and. It was just he
was jogging out. He jogged daily.
Right.
The county sheriff said there was nothing wrong. By the way, he died mysteriously in his home a few short years later. Sheriff Jack Harwell. He was the sheriff of during that time up there. But to me, it was just a bunch of bullshit. It really put the media in very bad light, from my perspective.
And people are still saturated with this nonsense, this propaganda years later. I remember I had a conversation with an older gentleman just a few years ago where I brought up that maybe the Branch Davidians shouldn't have been murdered. And his response was to get very angry with me. He said, "Hey, he said he was Jesus." And I said, "Well, so what? So what if he said I don't think that's true, but even if it was true, who cares? I mean, are we going to just go around and murder, set people on fire because their religion is slightly different from yours, or they interpret your religion in a slightly different way?" So for whatever reason, that particular smear campaign was really, really effective in preventing a lot of Christians from being sympathetic with what happened to the Branch Davidians.
And now they're throwing this bullshit out about, if you're against the government in any way, then you're a government extremist. You probably put on lists and this kind of thing. The whole thing is just, first off, you're not going to win that argument, because there's probably 50 to 60 million people in this country who disagree with some of the things the government's doing. Whether it's the war on terror bullshit,
I'd say it's 100%. Everybody in the country has something they don't think the government should be doing.
All right, so this whole business, you're not going to win that argument. Is this Mr. Doyle? Okay, folks, an exclusive here on the Jeff Davis Show, on the air with us for the next 15 minutes, Mr. Clive Doyle, live from Waco, Texas, and of course Clive spent the whole 51 days in the Mount Carmel facility. Clive, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, thanks for being on the show again, Clive.
It's my pleasure.
Joining us in the set here, we have Mr. Gary Teague and the regular co-host, Hassan Sadat, and they both have questions for you. So let's just turn it over to who wants to go first.
Gary, you go
Gary,
ahead.
Go ahead.
Clive, my question was, when those tanks rolled in, knocked the hole in the building, when did they actually use the tear gas?
They were using the tear gas on the morning of the 19th from about 6 o'clock on. So they were putting little holes in over the windows or over the doors and spraying it in off of the boom. And then, when they used up the gas on the tank, they would withdraw and go and get another load and come back. as each time they came and penetrated the building more and more of the building was down. You know, they were actually pushing whole sections in, and ultimately they were firing. They used all the gas that was supposed to last for 48 hours. They used it all within a couple of hours and ran out, so they started firing these ferret rounds, and I think they fired about 300 of those in.
Clive, I wanted to, you've answered this question on this show before, but I want to ask you again, because this is a continuing question that this program gets, and that is, why didn't you all just come out?
Well, for one thing, our coming out had been arranged prior to the 19th that David would be allowed to write his tract on the Seven Seals, and then we would all come out together. By the time the gassing started, we weren't sure whether we would be shot or what, because they were firing so much stuff into the building.
There was also razor wire around the building, right? Is that correct?
Hello?
Yes, sir. Go. Yeah, I said there was also razor wire around the entire building. Is that correct?
That's correct. The building was surrounded by razor wire, and like I said, we were going by what the negotiators were telling us, that this would all be arranged. We would come out in an orderly fashion when David would get through with the writing, but they started, like I say, penetrating the building with the tanks, firing the gas in, and spraying the gas in, and it was kind of risky to even try to come out in case the snipers would shoot us.
All right. Sasan?
Mr. Doyle, I have a question about, sort of how this got started, and you'll have to forgive my ignorance because, like most people, most of what I know about what happened in Waco comes from the mainstream media, and, as you're well aware, they've devoted a lot of their time and effort to smearing people like yourselves and the Davidians, your organization. What I'd like to know is, in retrospect, looking back now, why do you think that the feds decided to target your organization in the first place?
Well, there's a lot of suggested reasons why they did it. They were, it's quite possible that they were trying to make themselves look good. The ATF had, the initial raid by the ATF had been done as a promo for their looking good for a vote that was to be taken on their existence. There was talk about them being absorbed into other agencies. They were wanting to get their budget raised for the next year, different things like that, and so they wanted to put on a show to show that they were doing their job, I guess. But they had every opportunity for months before to do any investigation that they felt they needed to do by coming out. They were invited to come out and look at whatever weapons we had. They were invited to come and see and listen to what David was talking about and to inspect the place. But they chose to do it in this military-type onslaught rather than through peaceful means.
And what was their excuse at the time of why they chose to invade your building?
Well, they claimed that I guess they believed that we had weapons. Now, I don't know that they knew all that much about what weapons were there, other than the fact that they had been to the gun dealer where a lot of them were purchased. But I don't know that they had any evidence that there was anything illegal going on. So it didn't have to be done the way they did it, but they chose to put on this big show. They informed the media that we were that they were going to do this and that this would be a big story for them, and so the thing was filmed both by the media and by themselves.
and obviously a firefight began. My question is, to your knowledge, who started the firefight, or how did the actual shooting begin?
As far as, from my experience being on the inside, when David was told that the vehicles were coming into the property, he said, "There's somebody coming." They'd kind of had a warning that something was going to happen, and so he told some of us that were in the cafeteria section that he would go to the front door and see what they wanted. And so David went up to the front door, and by that time the two trucks and trailers with the agents in were unloading their cargo and attacking, running to the door with their guns drawn and so forth. And when he opened the door, they started shooting. Now, they claim that we shot first, but that's not what I recall and not what some of the other survivors recall of how it went down. The helicopters were firing at the back of the building towards the tower in the center. The agents at the front were firing. They were shooting our dogs. And so when David opened the door, he got shot through the wrist. And so he slammed the door again, and that's when people started retaliating and shooting back,
And how many people were killed on that first day, between the federal agents and the members of the Davidians?
There was 6 that ended up dead by the end of the day. One of those people that died was shot later in the day as they tried to get into Mount Carmel in the late afternoon, but there were 5 inside that died, and probably another 6 or so that were wounded.
There were reports that Branch Davidian Winston Blake was actually sitting at a table eating a piece of toast.
Well, not at a table. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in one of the back rooms, that faced the swimming pool at the back. And his room was the only one on that side of the hallway that had a window in it, but the window was covered by 3 big plastic water tanks, and so you couldn't see in and you couldn't see out of the room. And he was supposed to be, from what I heard, sitting on his bed eating the rest of, the remainder of his breakfast when the helicopters just shot up all the water tanks, and the bullets penetrated into the room and killed him right there and then on his bed.
Just sitting there eating breakfast.
Right, and by the time I got told that he was dead, I went running up there, and I thought it was kind of strange because as I approached his door, I could hear water running, and I thought, what the heck's that, And when I got in there, all this water was pouring into the room out of the tanks, and he was laying on the floor in a pool of water and blood.
Gary, go ahead.
Yeah,
Mike wants me to mention that Catherine Madison recently passed away.
Catherine Madison died October 6th of last year. She had a massive stroke. We had found her on a Friday night. Had to break into her apartment to and she was still alive at the time we found her, but we called the ambulance, and they came, but she didn't want to go with them. She was scared, I guess, that if she went to the hospital, she'd never come out alive. So when they heard that, they just turned around and basically left. And so a friend of mine and myself took care of her for about 3 or 4 more days, and she finally died on the 6th. And then because of problems with family and getting permission and everything, it ended up taking nearly 2 months to get her in the cemetery.
Tell us about what's going on tomorrow. Are you involved in the events tomorrow in Waco?
We're putting on a memorial. I've been involved in orchestrating a memorial every year since I got out of jail back in '94, and we've got Paul Fatter with us, who is one of the guys in the prison system. He just just this past May last year, got off of all of the restrictions of his early release program. And so he's going to be with us. He's here already, and he'll be there tomorrow. And a number of people are coming from different states. So anybody that wants to show up is welcome. We'll be honoring those, not only the ones that died back in 1993, but the fact that quite a number of the survivors have died since then, so we want to remember them too. And we'll be talking a little bit about them. We're going to let Paul talk and tell some of his experiences. And so everybody's invited.
And these people that were, these Davidians that were in jail, they were basically in there on phony charges, wouldn't you say?
Well, those of us that were put in jail and went, charged and went to court, all of us, I think, had the three main charges against us, which was conspiracy to murder federal agents, aiding and abetting the murder of federal agents, and carrying a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. All of us were found not guilty of the first two charges. Some of the guys that were in jail were found guilty on the third count, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. And the lawyers went up to the judge's bench after the sentence was announced, or not the sentence, but the verdict, and they said, how can you be found guilty of having a weapon during the commission of a crime if you're not guilty of a crime? And that was on a Saturday when the verdict was passed, and so the judge said he was going to get rid of that third decision, that third verdict of guilty on some of them, and but by the Monday he reinstated it, and later on when he was sentencing, he used that to throw the book at him and give them 40. Most of them got 40 years, and we had to go to the Supreme Court twice before it was reduced to 15. So most of them got off with good behavior, earlier than the 15 years. One young man from England was in there the longest, but he's back in England, and all of them are basically free. Unfortunately, last year, we had the bad news that one of them had died from hepatitis C. So whether he picked that up in the prison, I don't know, but he was just a young guy, and
Gary,
Go ahead.
Gary, you had a question, didn't you?
Were any of the federal agents convicted of anything that were involved with that?
No. There were agents that during our trial in San Antonio, many of the agents came across as, lying or tampering with evidence. All kinds of stuff came up in that trial, but nobody, to my knowledge, was ever held accountable. When we had our civil trial here in Waco, initially all of the agents were named in the case, including other members of the government, such as Janet Reno and so on, and the judge basically threw all of the individuals that were named in the case out, and so our civil trial ended up a bit of a fiasco where it was just us versus the government, with no named individuals.
Regarding media coverage, obviously once the shooting started and the standoff began, it became a media circus out there around the building. But from what I can remember, the media seemed to exclusively be getting information from and opinions from the federal agents that were there, their press operatives.
Most of the press that came to Waco, either for the raid or for during the siege for the next 51 days, instead of investigating and checking out the stories that they end up filing, they were basically just going to a morning briefing every day. The ATF or the FBI told them what they wanted to tell them, and that's what they reported. So a lot of it was misleading, and some of it was downright lies.
Did you have any kind of access to the media or any kind of way to communicate with them during the siege?
Not directly with the media, no.
Mm.
Well, early in the piece, perhaps on the first day, some contact was with radio people, but the press, as far as newspapers and so forth, we didn't have direct contact, to my knowledge.
It just seemed like one lie after another, Clive. Those first 4 or 5 days of the siege, it was just one. The kids were being abused. Well, that turned out to be a lie, because I've got the head of the Texas CPS on video saying that they investigated those charges and they were false.
That's correct.
And then the next day, you all had illegal guns in there, which, there were several FFL dealers, at least a couple that were Branch Davidians that were selling these guns legally. And then the final thing was, well, David Koresh said he was Jesus. It was just like, we'll say this day, this next day. That's not good enough. We'll say this today, and tomorrow, if that's not good enough, we'll say this. It just seemed like, to me, just really like a bunch of bullshit.
Well, they changed their story from day to day, like you said, as it suited them, because a lot of stuff that they said right off the bat, a lot of the stuff they presented in court as their story turned out to be a lie or misinformation and so forth. And on many occasions, under cross-examination, they had to eat their words, but they were never held accountable for perjury or for contempt of court or any of that kind of stuff. A lot of them, I guess, took early retirement, and the rest of them all seemed to get promotions or a reward for what they did.
And how many times during the siege did the feds attempt to invade the building? How many attempts were made to capture who was in the building?
The only raid was on February 28th when the ATF came in shooting. Mm-hmm. By the time basically the shooting was over, there was no further shooting until April 19th of 93, when they came in with the tanks and started firing the ferret rounds and lobbing the flashbangs and all that all over again. And so, that was, they said we were shooting at the tanks, which was kind of a waste of time with pop guns. But,
right.
They said they never fired a shot on April 19th. I said, well, I don't know what firing a ferret round, which is like a rocket with fins and everything, which comes crashing through the wind. If that's not firing, I don't know what is, And so there may have been, I didn't hear anybody shooting back at them on April 19th, but according to different ones that have seen video footage or flare footage, indicate that there was some exchange of fire. But basically it was in self-defense. When you got tanks as big as your living room pushing through doors and coming into the building and destroying the floors and everything else, I could understand people shooting back.
And speaking of video footage, if I recall, the late Terry Liberty Parker, a former co-host of the show and co-host of Live and Let Live back in the 90s, showed some video that appeared to show those tanks shooting flames into the building, that they had some kind of flame-throwing devices mounted to the tanks. Can you confirm seeing anything like that?
No, I don't. I remember there was a lawyer by the name of Linda Thompson who put out a couple of videos called The Big Lie, in which she showed videos supposedly showing flames being shot in there, but I think that was misleading, and it didn't show the full length of the tape. When you see it in a uncut version or an unedited version, there is something that appears like flames, but then the ones I've seen, a driver gets out of, or somebody gets out of the tank and goes and brushes it off. So I figured it was something that, like foil or whatever, that they were dragging out of the walls when they would penetrate. They could back out when this something that would catch the sunlight would be glittering off of this material and make it look like flame. But I don't recall any flames. If that was the case, then you would have had the building burning way before 12 o'clock, you know.
Well, let me just say, the bottom line is, Clive, whether there's fire shooting or whatever, the bottom line is, you know, we can't have a government that goes around arbitrarily. That, I mean, from my perspective, and whether they shot flames or whatever, just the idea that they jumped into tanks and drove those tanks into these buildings occupied by men, women, and children.
Right.
We just can't have that here in America. That's my take.
We really appreciate you.
Yeah,
calling in,
do you have anything else? We're fixing to play 17 Little Children. Do you have any final comment, Clive?
Let me just say that the memorial tomorrow is going to be at the Country Inn and Suites, which is on the south side of Interstate 35, the access road. It's over in the Belmead area, just opposite from the Walmart, and it starts at 10 and goes till 1. If anybody interested in coming to.
Well, Mike Hanson and Jeff Davis will be there.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Look forward to